The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
My parents were a little bit radical in their parenting techniques. They kind of subscribed to the wolf theory. You know, you give them a warm den and a lot of other furry creatures to play with and enough food, and give them an occasional, smack and a little nip, and they'll grow up just fine, and mostly it worked out. But the one thing they did do, the most structured thing they did, was we had dinner together every night. This is an anomaly now, but then it was very common. And at dinner every night, from pretty much the time any one of us could read, and there were 6 kids, as soon as we could read, we would read something in the newspaper and come to the dining room table prepared to tell about it. And the telling about it shifted as we got older. And by the time we were about 11, my father wanted us to move to the editorial page. And then we needed to come with an editorial about which we'd done some research. And then periodically in the middle of dinner, he would go, okay, switch sides. And so this makes you very facile in lying, if not in good finding. So I grew up believing that everyone at the table had the right to an opinion. I'm sure my opinions reflected my parents a great deal. I was, 11, 12, 13. But by the time I was 13, and my extended family was also similar and very verbal. So I thought 13-year-olds were as entitled to have political opinions at the table as anyone else. And so when I was just shy of 13, my parents moved from New York City to a small town on Long Island, about 1.5 miles long, half a mile wide, population 400 people. Very odd. And I'm a friendly girl, and it was the 8th grade, and people were very nice, even though I was the new kid. It kind of broke all the rules about not being nice to the new kid. And at about the end of the 8th grade, one of the most popular girls in my class invited me to lunch on Saturday. Shelley was everything I hoped to be. She had this perfect curly hair that did what she wanted, and it went in a perfect 1963, because that was the year, flip with a little bow, and her clothes were impeccable and always tidy. And she had a great smile, and she was a JV cheerleader and really, really smart and nice, and I thought, wow, okay, I've got it made. And so on the appointed Saturday, I went to her house for lunch, and it was the perfect kind of house. Joe and Kate have heard stories about my house with 27 cats, 9 dogs, a boa constrictor, It was messy and untidy. My mother was a painter. My father was also a painter. So it was unpredictable and loud and noisy. Her house wasn't. It was beautiful and clean and neat, and lunch was not kind of an ersatz thrown together leftovers, but Campbell's tomato soup and a tuna fish sandwich on white bread, and a glass of milk on a perfectly set table. And it was her mother and father and me and Shelley and her brother, whose name I think was Brian, but I'm not sure. I thought I had died and gone to heaven, and I was so excited. And I did my very best, and I didn't cross my legs, and I didn't put my elbows on the table, and I didn't slurp my soup. But I did, in fact, volunteer an opinion. When her father said something to her mother, somewhat semi-political, I piped up with what I thought was a good opinion. And then her mother said something to her father, and I piped up and thought it was kind of a good opinion. And in about no time, it seemed that nobody else was talking, and that was kind of horrifying. And I went home, and I was never asked back again. And I was absolutely crushed. And I couldn't figure out what I had done wrong. But I was in the 8th grade, and I was resilient, and I had lots of friends. And so I moved on. At the end of the 9th grade, my school went out on strike. There was a dress code, a very strict dress code. Locust Valley High School is on the north shore of Long Island, and very Republican. And so girls were not allowed to have skirts above their knee, and boys had to wear socks, and they couldn't have hair down below their collar. And we decided to protest, and the protest centered around one young man, Claude Thibault, who was a senior, from France. He was very French and very handsome. And not only was he sophisticated and very French and very handsome, but he was also a star athlete. And they were not going to let him play because he wouldn't cut his hair. And this was outrageous to us. And so the school went out on strike. We walked out of high school. We walked out of high school and stood around. And it was a scandal. It was a scandal in 1965, I think it was. And the newspaper came, Newsday came, and the radio came, and eventually the vice principal quit, and there was quite a to-do. But while we're standing out there, I had called my mother to let her know on the payphone what was happening, and my mother, bless her, I come from a union card-carrying family of Democrats, arrived with a picnic basket of food for me and my friends. Yay, Mom, in her old Volkswagen with her paint-stained jeans rolled up at the bottom, cigarette holder. And she delivered the food, and you have some moments when you're proud of your parents when you're young. Mostly they annoy you, but this was one of her really good ones. And then behind her pulled up a red sedan, much newer than my mother's Volkswagen, and out of the car got Mrs. Principe, Shelley's mother. And I looked at her and I thought, well, maybe, because I had figured out there was probably a difference between her parents and mine, but maybe, I thought, sitting there with my friends Maureen and Carol, maybe we weren't so different, and maybe we could be friends. Maybe her mother was going to give her lunch too, and maybe her mother and my mother would have a chat. And then her mother grabbed her by the hair and began to smack her and dragged her into the car, screaming about what an embarrassment she was to her family. And my heart broke. It broke for her, it broke for me because I knew we would never be friends. And it let me see my parents, their odd, quirky, avant-garde, Greenwich Village hippie ways, as something I was glad to live with. They were a little bit crazy, but they would never do that. They were to the left of center and sometimes embarrassing, but they would never do that. And it was in that moment I knew that being raised like a wolf might not be the worst thing in the world.
The book is told in the first person. And so if you will imagine going back to the 1800s where all of the modern conveniences we have today are not there, communication is not there, and life is slower and a lot more simple, and in some cases not quite as nice as we have it today. My name is Elsie Dowdle, and in 1854 I came to Dowagiac, Michigan to find a new family. Before that, I lived in New York City with my parents, my father and my mother. We lived in a nice building, an apartment. I had my own bedroom. I had 3 meals a day. I had a bed to sleep in. I thought everybody had those things. I had a lot to learn that year I was 10 years old. We lived in a 3-story building. My father was in charge of it. He was the custodian. He made sure that the windows were clean and the steps were swept. He shoveled the snow in the winter. He made repairs. So he was around all day long. At night, he wrote stories for magazines and newspapers. He sold them. My father was the most honest person I knew. He never told the owner of the building that he did something that he hadn't done. And when he counted his words to sell his stories, he counted them 2 and 3 times so that he would not charge more than he was producing. My mother, she kept pigeons up on the roof. And she fed those pigeons and she raised them, and then she would sell them to butchers or to restaurants. And they would buy them, and that increased our income. I didn't know much about that then, but I knew that I had a pretty good life. Mom would use those pigeons for us on the holidays. We'd have roast squab. That's really cooked chicken, or cooked pigeon, I mean. She served them with turnips and baked potatoes. She taught me how to sew and to cook and to read music. I had a good life. But there's one thing my parents did not know about me, and that is, whenever I would leave the house, my mother would give me an apple or a piece of cheese or a hunk of bread to take with me to nibble on. I gave those things away a lot of the time. You see, when I got to the street, I would meet this girl. She was about my age, a little shorter than myself. We both had blonde hair, My mother said the color of my hair was a dirty blonde. Hers was really dirty. Her clothes weren't as nice as mine. They weren't as clean as mine. I knew she was a beggar, but I didn't really know what that meant. I thought she just begged and then went home at night. She called me Missy. She'd say, "Thank you, Missy," when I'd give her what I had in my pocket, and then I wouldn't see her for a few days. Well, this one particular day, I left the house with something in my pocket that I gave to Meg, and I went about my business. New York City. You're always smelling smoke in New York City. Everything's made of wood. Well, not everything, but most of the things. And people use wood to cook their meals or to keep their houses warm. There were fires, lots of fires. And it was exciting when the wagons would come down the street being pulled by the firemen. Dogs would chase them, children would chase them, and people would be yelling and screaming, and oh, it was very exciting. But you know, I was 10 by then, and if the wagon didn't come right down my street, I wasn't really that interested in chasing it anymore. So this day, when I heard the wagons, they were about a block off. I didn't chase them. When I got home to my neighborhood, the smell of smoke was heavy in the air. When I got to my street, my house was gone. How do you leave a 3-story building in the morning and come home later to ashes and rubble? I looked around trying to find my parents. There were people on the street. Some of them had blankets on, and some of them were holding each other, and I just couldn't find my parents. So I thought I'd look for a constable or maybe a fireman. And I looked around, and there was a group of firemen standing there, so I went over to them. But it was odd, because it was like the firemen were hiding one of their own. And I realized he was crying. A grown man was crying. Never in my life seen or heard of a grown man crying. And the other firemen were hiding him like they were ashamed of him. But I could hear him say, I couldn't get to them. I just couldn't get to them. And deep down inside me, I knew he was talking about my parents. I sat down on the curb, and I felt water on my hand, and I looked down, and I was crying, just like that fireman. And I was watching the people go by and hoping. And then there was a hand on my shoulder, and a little voice said, "Come on, Missy. Crying never did nobody no good nohow." And Meg was right there beside me. She lifted me by the arm, and she took my hand, and she led me away. I just followed her. I did look back once, but she yanked me and said, "Come on, let's go." I didn't know where we were going, and to tell you the truth, I didn't really care. Someone else was in charge, and I was willing to follow her. She took me to places that I'd never been, and then she turned down an alleyway. Now, there's one thing you ought to know about me. When I get scared or nervous, I get the hiccups. Not like you get the hiccups, but they start down deep in my belly, and they come up my throat, and I just can't stop hiccuping. Well, there were 3 boys in that alley, just standing there with their arms crossed, blocking our way, and I saw them, and I stopped, and I pulled my hand away from Meg, and the hiccups started. And Meg turned around and looked at me like, "What's the matter with you?" And I couldn't talk with those hiccups. I just pointed to those boys. And Meg turned around, and she looked at them, and she went, she walked down to one of them and slapped him on the arm and said, "Get out of the way. This is my friend, and you leave her alone." I was so startled, I guess I stopped breathing funny, and my hiccup stopped. You know, when you first meet somebody, you think one thing about them, but after you get to know them, you think another thing. I used to think that Meg was timid and shy and bashful and quiet. I had just found out she was in charge. She was a strong person. And she was going to be my salvation. now that I was starting to live on the streets of New York City.
I was riding my bike as fast as I could. I was late for dinner again. I was chronically late for dinner, and it drove my parents crazy. I came around the curve of the creek where my parents lived. My knees were pumping up and down, up and down, up and down, and my white Keds on those black pedals were going so fast they were kind of a gray blur. I had my sights fixed on a point about a third of the way up our driveway, which was about a quarter mile long and about a 45-degree angle. I never made it all the way up. It was my sincerest and fondest hope that someday I would. And so what I would do was ride as fast as I could and look at the point and try and make it to the point. And I was so concentrating on catching up and being on time and making it up the hill that I sort of felt and heard the squish and crunch before I saw it, and when I looked down, I stood on my brakes really hard and then put my brand new white Keds right down into the middle of a crushed and very wet horseshoe crab. They were everywhere, all around me. I couldn't figure out why. All the way from before my parents' driveway to Cat Hollow Road, which is the next road over, the road was littered with dead and dying horseshoe crabs. I love horseshoe crabs. The very first one I ever collected, I was no more than 5. I found a little tiny carapace, no bigger than my dad's thumbnail, and I dried it, and it had been on the mantle ever since. And now my collection at the time of this story went from little tiny all the way up to dinner plate size, and there was no reason for them to be on the road. Every once in a while, my parents lived at the beach. One or two would get confused after mating, and they'd climb across this narrow beach and end up on the road, but everybody in town would scoop them up and take them back to the water and slip them in where they belonged. And I thought, well, maybe it was a full moon or a high tide or hundreds and hundreds of them, and I was so sad. I started to cry. I forgot about dinner. I forgot about the driveway. Instead, I put down my kickstand, and very gently and carefully as I could, I picked up each one and I piled them in the basket of the bicycle, and I wheeled it across the parking lot to the great big 55-gallon drum at the end of the town pier. And I put them in carefully on top of the newspapers all littered with fish scales and fish heads. 3 or 4 trips it took to clear up as many as I could, and I was covered in crushed crab guts and sobbing, and by the time I wheeled my bike up, I'd long missed dinner. And I explained to my father what had happened, and nobody was mad. My mother washed out my clothes, and no one could figure it out either. We thought it was just some weird anomaly. By the next morning, I put on my slightly damp favorite shorts that I wore all the time and my shirt, and I took my bike back down to the bottom of our driveway. It was way more fun going down at the end, and as I scooted to the end and went to turn right, I could hear them. Not the crabs again, something else, a sound that was unmistakable, the hooting and hollering of boys. I was just 13. Boys were not high on my list of things I wanted to hear hooting and hollering. And I thought I could see at the end of the parking lot 3 of them doing something I thought I could figure out. So I wheeled across the little tiny pebbles and went around the side of the lifeguard shack and made it halfway across the parking lot, and I could see them. It was George and Billy and one of their friends, the neighborhood bullies. George had a big horseshoe crab in his hand. He had it over his head, and he smashed it down on the ground, and they whoa at the top of their lungs, and I was pissed. 2 more times before I could even make my feet move. I started to ride towards them, and I screamed, "Cut that out! Put that down now! You can't do that!" in a way that only a skinny little red hair, freckled, kind of all knees and elbows girl can do. They looked at me. "Put it down," said George. "I'll put it down." He picked up a really big one and smashed it on the ground twice. I was furious. "Don't you dare!" I rode as hard as I could. I rode right up to George, and then I rode right up him. right up his naked leg to the edge of his shorts. I pushed him down on the ground, and then I jumped off my bike and onto him. And I punched him as hard as my cousins had taught me how to without putting my thumbs inside so they wouldn't break. And I whomped him, and I whomped him, and I whomped him. And all of a sudden I realized what I was doing, which was not something my mother would have approved of. I didn't think, although on balance, crabs, George. But I hopped off, and I was not going to cry in front of those boys, even though what I wanted to do more than anything right then was cry. My hands hurt, my heart hurt. I didn't know what to do, and my father was nowhere around. And I realized that they were much bigger than me, way much bigger than me. However, something about how I looked and how I wiped underneath my nose and how I wiped the blood and the snot on my shorts made them wonder just what it was about me that was so scary. They backed up, turned around and ran, grabbed their bikes, and took off. Once again, I gathered up all of those crab bodies, and I piled them all in the 55-gallon drum, which at this point was pretty much full. And I wheeled my way back up to my parents' house before lunch. It was a Saturday. My father was home. So I explained what happened, and while I sobbed in his arms, he explained to me that there were people that were mean, that I had done the right thing, that even though I had hit George as hard as I could and made him bleed, and even though I had left tire tracks on his leg, which is not something he would ordinarily have approved of, in this case, there was an argument to be made for my behavior. George and I did eventually get to be friends, about 2 years later. He never apologized for what he did, but as far as I know, he never killed another crab.
My ma gave me a nickel to buy a pickle. I didn't buy a pickle. I bought some chewing gum. All my life, I've been a gum chewer. And I got it from my family. Each member of my family had their own specialty, their own gum. For instance, my mother's gum was Dentine. Now, nowadays, you can go to the store and you can buy Dentine in different flavors. Not back when I was a kid. It came in one flavor, and that's the only flavor, the only gum that she would give me. You had to unwrap it, and you only got this little piece, and you got one piece a day because it was good for your teeth. But my grandmother, in her purse were chiclets. Now chiclets are small pieces too, but they're not individually wrapped. And chiclets were a reward. Graham, can I have, it might be something in the house, I wasn't asking you to buy me something, but can I play with maybe one of the knickknacks on her shelf? Yes, you can if you're gentle, and if you handle it gently, I'll give you a chiclet. Well, of course I was going to handle it gently. But also, Nancy Marie, have you made your bed this morning? Not yet, Graham. Well, there's a chiclet in it for you if you do. Well, that bed was made in no time. Yeah, Graham knew how to control her children, her grandchildren, with chiclets. And she never gave you just one, but you got the second one when you did the second thing. My father, now, he didn't carry gum in his pocket, but you'd be in a store and you'd go, "Hey, Dad, they sell double bubble gum here." Well, he'd buy 2 pieces, one for you and one for him. No, didn't have to do anything to earn it. And we'd unwrap them together, and we'd read the little cartoon about Bazooka Joe. "Hey, Bazooka Joe, where do you find a 400-pound monkey?" Any place he wants to be. We would laugh. My father and I would laugh. And then we'd have contests. We'd hold that gum until he'd say, "Go!" We'd throw it in our mouth, and we'd chew, and the first one to make a bubble was the winner. Yeah, Dad and double bubble. Wow. Those are good memories. To chewing gum, to chewing gum. I didn't buy a pickle, I bought some chewing gum. Not all adults appreciated chewing gum when I was a kid. And one of that class of adults that really did not appreciate chewing gum at all were teachers. Now, I was the type of kid that if someone said to me, "You can't," well, that was like throwing down the gauntlet. That was a challenge. So when the teachers would say, "You may not chew gum in my class," I had to try it. And I was very good at it. I knew how to unwrap that under my desk so that the paper didn't crinkle. And then I waited until the teacher's back was turned. I'd pop it in. And I'd take a few beginning chews. But the teacher would look at us and I'd be there, all attention, until she turned around again. And I would chew some more. I could get away with it until we do math. Math made you think. And your mouth wasn't paying attention. And it would start to chew while you're doing that problem. Get caught every time. And teachers weren't fair. They didn't just say, "Throw away that piece." They'd say, "Throw away that piece and give me the rest of them." No. Teachers just didn't understand about chewing gum. My mom gave me a quarter to tip the porter. I didn't tip the porter. I bought some chewing gum. You know, chewing gum had its own culture, its own songs like, "Oh, does your chewing gum lose its flavor on the bedpost overnight?" And when your mother says, "Don't chew it, do you swallow it in spite?" Oh, that was a good song. We liked that one. Or there was, "Double your pleasure, double your fun, double good, double mint gum." Oh yeah, it was a commercial, but we sang it anyways. In those commercials, in the beginning, there was just one double mint commercial with two girls ice skating, dressed exactly the same. They were twins. And they did the same movement at the same time, and they were pretty cool. Well, under our Christmas tree, there was a village that my mother had made all of the houses for. She'd made them out of ceramic, she'd painted them, she decorated them. She was very talented. She even took a Christmas card that had a clear cellophane on it, and she cut that out and made it the window of the church in the village. Every year she would go down to Woolworth's, the 5 and 10, and she would buy these little iron figures to decorate the village. One year she bought a girl on ice skates with her arms out and her leg back. And a couple years later, she bought the identical same one. So we had two. And my sister and I called them the Double Mint twins. Every Christmas, when we'd put that village under the tree, we'd each take a Double Mint girl. One of us would run to the bathroom to get a mirror to put down for the ice skating rink. We'd get cotton and put it all around it. And then each of us would hold our twin and we'd sing that song at the top of our lungs for anyone within the whole apartment complex to hear. And then we'd put them on the ice. After my mother's passing, my sister and I were divvying up all the things in the house. She took some of the Christmas village, I took some of the Christmas village. And then when we got to those Double Mint girls, "You want to take them?" "No, you take them." Well, we each took one. And so every year I know that when I put my village under the tree and I sing my Double Mint song, that in North Carolina, my sister and her family are doing the same thing. Chew chewing gum, chew chewing gum. I didn't tip the porter, I bought some chewing gum. I still chew gum. And I was fortunate enough to marry a man who indulged me in that. Whenever we would stop on the thruway or go through a store that had a bubble gum machine, he would hand me a quarter. I had my own money, but he would hand me a quarter and say, "Go ahead, you're going to get a red one." And you know, I'd put that quarter in and I'd get a red one. The man was psychic. He'd give me another quarter and say, "I want a white one." And he'd put the money in and a white one would come down that chute, and there we'd go. Well, there was a restaurant, there still is, if you live in the Buffalo area, the Royal Restaurant on the corner of Military and Sheridan. He took me in there once, and they had the most amazing bubblegum machine. It was about 6 feet high. There was a half-foot reservoir of bubblegum balls on the top. It was 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep. It was amazing. You put your money in, and 2 balls dropped out of that reservoir. And they went all through these antics, and music would play, dun 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 dun, and bells would ring, and lights would come on, and things would flash, and things would twirl, and these balls would be spun and thrown and caught and wrenched up and thrown down. Came down in a parachute at one point, and they would race to the bottom. And he would always call the color that would hit the bottom first. That was about 30 seconds of this wildness. Once both balls hit that end at the same time, we got 2 for the price of 1. My mom gave me $1 to stand up and holler. I didn't stand and holler. I bought some chewing gum. You know, this should be the end of the story, but it's not. Because a couple years ago, my sister-in-law took me back to that same restaurant in the same place, the corner of Military and Sheridan, and we went into the Royal Restaurant, and the machine wasn't there. My sister-in-law got upset. We went and sat down, and we looked at the menus, and the waiter came over and said, "What can I do for you?" And my sister-in-law said, "Put the bubblegum machine back." The poor man, he was probably new there. He had no idea what she was talking about. And he said, well, my sister-in-law here wrote a story about that bubblegum machine, and we came to see it, and it's not there. Excuse me, I'll get the manager. The manager came, and Donna, it's okay, Donnie, it's all right. No, it's not all right. You wrote a story about that bubblegum machine, and they should put it back. So that's the end of the story. Cha-choo, choo, chewing gum, cha-choo, choo, chewing gum. I didn't stand and holler. I bought some chewing gum.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round,